So for Fantastic Arcade this year, I did a set of 3 projects. 2 of them are collaborations with other people, and one of them was just me. The first of these is an audiovisual instrument, as in musical instrument, which I did with Tammy Duplantis. And one of these is a collaboration with Katie Rose Pipkin, who may or may not be in town for part of this. And then the third of these is called Panic Variants. So I'll dive in because I've got a lot of pieces to cover here. So Pluinola is a piece that is sort of in the vein of some of Tammy's solo work, which I'll go into now. Tammy specifically mentioned wanting this project mentioned as like relevant to this. So this project is a set of 3 instruments. They're available on itch.io if anyone wants to download them and check them out. They're technically Game Boy games, but each of them is an audiovisual instrument which you can perform music with. So they use the various inputs of the Game Boy, which has 2 primary buttons and a D-pad with 4 directions to control different functions of a music generating program of some sort. Each of them is different. Each of these slides is one of the pieces within that. And I'd always been really taken by some of Tammy's interactive work. She's also done a whole bunch of really neat stuff with like other types of maybe slightly more conventional, but not much more conventional electronic music. But I really like these pieces specifically, and I was interested in doing something somewhat in that vein collaboratively. So before looking at the collaboration, this is some work by me that's sort of in that vein as well. The project that we did uses cellular automata, which for folks which is probably everyone who aren't terribly familiar with them, are systems that have a set of cells that automatically run a set of rules that change the cells over time. So a really simple one would be like, take a checkerboard, plonk a checker in the middle of it, and the rule is put a checker to the right of a checker. So you'd eventually just like build a line of checkers all the way across the board. And a slightly more complicated one might look like these. So these are 3-state cellular automata. So there's this background color, which is orangish here, and this sort of magenta-ish color, and also some black pixels in here somewhere. And so these are all basically the same. I've violated the unspoken no internet connectivity rule. That's okay, I don't really need to demo that. Back to the slideshow. So yeah, cellular automata can do a lot of different sorts of things, and I've used them in different capacities in different projects. I've used them for background environments. Why won't Chrome let me full screen when I'm in present mode? That's ridiculous. This is ridiculous. Come on, Chrome. Come on, Chrome. You can do it. I believe in you. Thank you. Okay. So I've used them sort of cosmetically in some games. This is Strawberry Cubes, which I did a couple of years ago. All the tiles here that you can see, as well as this sort of like background fluff / plasma stuff, is all live cellular automata. This is another project that I did this year. This is an arcade game sort of in the vein of like Robotron, if folks have seen that. And this uses them in a more functional capacity. Here, the walls are like actively changing shape and responding to player input. That's an interesting error. I hope that doesn't do that for all of my slides. I may have to get online here. That's fun. See if I can get these to buffer. Sorry about that, folks. No, it looks like only those ones are broken. I think I'm in luck. I think, yeah, just those ones are broken. Okay. I'll just skip these. Okay, so I've used CA in various projects of my own, and I thought it'd be fun to take some of that and work it into a generative music context. So I asked Tammy if she'd be interested, and this is the slide where I ask if I can make really loud sounds in the theater. All right, I'm having full screen problems again. Come on, come on, come on. Yes, okay. So this is the finished project. So you can play this down in the arcade, so I won't do a belabored demonstration, but basically there is a rule, which you can sort of see down here at the bottom. It's very, very small. And you can mutate the rule, and the output at any given moment is mapped directly to sound. So like the left side here is the low end of the spectrum, and the right side here is the high end of the spectrum. And then like each of the rules has like various sort of timbral qualities. Like this one's fun, it's sort of a shepherd's tone. And then we also have some controls for like more directly performatively tweaking things. Like I've got it going really slowly now, and I'm like sort of narrowing it down so you only get like the middle of the spectrum, and it's really fast. And anyway, yeah, you can go mess with it yourselves if you're curious to hear it and experiment with it on your own. So Tammy and I consider this sort of a first public debut of the piece, but we're interested in sort of playing with this and maybe exposing some finer controls in the future, and it'll be fun to see where it goes. Okay, so the second project that I wanted to talk about here is my collaboration with Katie Rose Pipkin. We have this sort of a long-running project idea. We pitched this a while ago and unfortunately didn't get the grant. We wanted to make a set of full-scale replica plastic Antarctic paleoflora. So like prehistoric plants and things done in like the same sorts of like materials you'd get like a giant plastic palm tree in a Mexican restaurant, that sort of texture. Unfortunately, we didn't get the grant, but the idea was kicking around, and so this came up, and we decided to do sort of a digital spin on that. The initial idea was to have a sort of a boutique that had a product line consisting entirely of these like very posh replicas of extinct trees and plants and things. And you'd like visit the show floor, and like someone would hand you a glossy brochure and so on. So we were like, well, what kind of a rendition of this could we do in interactive format? And we were initially going to have it be fully 3D, bunch of like intricate models of things. Then we started taking it in a slightly more abstract direction. Oh, not quite this abstract. This is like an early ring error. But so what we ended up doing, which you can kind of see now that it's scrolled far enough to the right, is a bunch of flat layers that are all moving around in parallax. I really like all these early graphical mistakes. It's like maybe my favorite part of projects. So I put in a bunch of slides of these. The finished project itself is it's a composite of all of these layers, which Katie Rose built up in 3D, in the Unity editor actually, which we then like rendered out into panoramas essentially. They're not like panoramas in a traditional sense. They're like technically rings with a sort of like near and front plane clipping. So you only get like everything from like 3 feet away from you to like 15 feet away from you, and then you like step out and sample another ring, and then step out and sample another ring. So you're sort of moving through this like composite flattened landscape that's made up of all these things that were formerly 3D. And then this structure in the center here is what our initial boutique idea turned into. Sort of abstract slippage away from like the initial idea, but we've got this kind of, if anyone's seen like old black and white Mac OS software made in HyperCard. It's sort of got a bit of a textual reference to that here. I had fun doing the Venetian blinds thing. So here we are in the interior of this structure, taking a look at all of the various wares being offered to us. Yeah. Although for reference, even though we've made this version now, if anyone wants to throw like $10,000 at like doing the original idea with giant plastic plants, like hit me up after this. I can't promise they're market worthy. Here are a few more of these like earlier rendering experiments. I had a lot of fun with this one. This was like, we didn't have all of our data in yet. This was just a bunch of grids that were all moving in parallax. And I don't know, it partitioned space so nicely. I found it really compelling. You get such a sense of the volumes. And then I'll move on to the third of these, which is the one I did alone. So this is panic variants. I've had an idea kicking around for a while to do a project that's sort of in the vein of Lode Runner or, say, Jumpman. There are a lot of these sort of early home computer and console games that have this format of a large number of fairly small levels, many of which are not necessarily very apparently connected to one another. They're a lot more granular than modern games tend to be. And I guess I'd never really made anything like that, and I find myself in design debt to several of these. I find them really compelling. I wanted to do something somewhat in that vein. And also, I think given the current political climate, I find myself somewhat compelled to do something a little bit less unquestioningly gamey with that set of mechanical foundations, shall we say. So what I started thinking about was this direction that we're moving in of increasing tendency to turn all kinds of things that were once just part of our everyday lives into paid services. This fragmentation of like everything that we do into like, okay, now you have to engage with this one particular corporation to like get a ride to the theater, and you have to like engage with this other corporation to like talk to someone long distance, or paying like some carrier and like paying someone else to make hardware. And like, if you keep fragmenting like that, you end up with this like very strange set of like handshaking procedures that really dominate your emotional bandwidth. So the world of panic variants is one in which there's a set of people who are maybe not humans in the natural sense. Maybe they're manufactured laborers of some sort, and you play as one of them. And both your labor, which is playing this game, and your leisure activities are entirely within the confines of this captive market, something like an old-style company town. So you get this, let me skip forward a little bit here. You get this loop of running through sections of the world and playing this sort of Lode Runner-esque game where you're collecting all these resources, which you're then delivering back to this company. And then like ending up back in your apartment, which is what the screen is. So you start out with this like sort of 256 cell square that you live in, and you have to pay a premium per month for like every square unit of space that you want to lease, and you have to pay fees for like water, and different grades of light cost different amounts of money. If you want like the good full spectrum light, you're gonna have to pay the big bucks for it. So you like wandering around through this sort of space station-esque environment that connects all these people's lives when they're not working or at home, and kind of going back to your apartment and like trying to like buy a better sofa, or like maybe if you're lucky save up for like a photo of a plant, because there's no way you could ever afford a real plant. And then you run back into this sort of like Lode Runner land. You're like running around and collecting gold and stuff, and then over the course of the game, it sort of disintegrates into a slightly more open landscape. When you first play it, you're like very much in the clutches of this kind of gamey collectionist kind of thing, and it presents itself superficially as if you're captive to that, as if there is no way out. And over time, you find sort of chinks in the armor, a way of like changing the destination that a door leads to, or going through a wall that you thought you couldn't go through before, getting objects from one level to like glitch out and appear in a different one. And by learning to engage with those systems as you're replaying this game, you find more and more of these points at which you can like exit the confines and go off and do your own thing. And I won't say too much about like where it ends up, but that's sort of the overall shape of things. I will switch to the game itself now. Oh wait, which I've closed. Running a little chuggy here because I'm like doing duplicate instead of project. It's all right. So when I started working on this, I started out with this idea that I wanted to do something that had a fairly small number of mechanics superficially, which could then be sort of telescoped into a wider set of mechanics. So okay, if you look at this 18 over here, if you climb this ladder here, I'm probably gonna have to cheat here. Oh no, I do have 2 energy. Okay, so one of the verbs that you have is that you can shoot projectiles, which wrap around the edge of the world. So I just shot myself there. But I have 1 more energy, with which I'm gonna shoot this one over here, which is now a 2. So now this door, which used to lead back to like the apartment complex, leads like 16 levels, because it's base 16, not base 10. 16 levels further than it used to. So that's like one example of like something that is like superficially like just a normal gaming mechanic that ends up like having other functions. So yeah, this didn't actually get me anywhere. I just like teleported to this restaurant instead of going back to the main entrance of the apartment building. But yeah, in other contexts, that particular trick would get you places you wouldn't normally be allowed to go. The exploratory process that I went through before making this game involved a lot of research. I went through this obsessive phase of digging up many games, sort of in the vein of Lode Runner. One of them, which ended up being kind of mechanically similar to this, is a Russian game for the only sanctioned home computer system in the mid-'80s, which I'm not going to be able to pronounce correctly, but it transliterates to something like Clad, I believe, K-L-A-D. And it's sort of a Lode Runner-esque thing where you can only dig horizontally, which I sort of ended up aping mechanically through sort of long roundabout route of trying different things. And gosh, there's so many things in that genre. It's really fascinating. Like digging around, you end up finding all of these sort of strange mirror images of the same core set of mechanics, which I find really fascinating. There's this sort of fixation on the gimmick mechanic in a lot of the indie sphere. You want to make like a soccer game except with worms, or like a swappable dress-up game except with penises, or like puzzle game except time goes backwards sometimes. And honestly, I find it kind of hollow and shameful that we're so caught up in that mentality. This idea that we have to turn ourselves into this sort of weird, hollow echo of the commercial landscape that we live in. Like if you make something, what's valuable about it is the personal, and this is the apartment complex that you live in here. all of these are locked except for number 5, which is the player's home. So yeah, I was thinking a lot, like looking at this landscape of like highly interlinked, very old games that were like aped each other so directly, about the way that they imitated each other, this tendency that they had to not only like directly imitate mechanics and aesthetics of other games, but to explore very thoroughly this sort of small territory in this strange methodical sort of way. It gives you sort of an interesting opportunity to interrogate like what exactly the core of a genre is, looking at all these like strange personal takes on it. The substance of them becomes less about the originality of the mechanics, which is what we tend to focus on more now in evaluating a game, and more on the texture. Like what is it that makes like this mechanically identical clone of Lode Runner that has a different brand name different from original Lode Runner? Like they actually have the same levels because they ripped the data from like the MSX version of the game, but they feel different, right? One of them was made for this weird, cheap computer that only existed in a couple of countries in Europe, and it had these weird graphical constraints, and they like smashed the sprites into like a slightly smaller space and didn't carefully redraw them, so that's this like weird squiggly quality that you didn't get in the original. And that ended up becoming the substance of it, like all of these particulars of these artifacts of how it was made, these personal decisions that were involved in bringing the thing from the drawing board to people's computers. I'm gonna go back to my slides here. Which I think are still open, maybe. Oh, I hope they are. Okay, yes, they are. I just skipped over them. Yeah, so this is the first public version of Panic Variants. At this point in time, it has a fairly substantial set of normal gamey levels, and what I'm planning on doing with sort of future iterations of this idea is gradually expanding the uncharted properties of the game, the sets of interactions between the permitted elements and the supposedly non-permitted elements, those that in world are not permitted. So sort of gradually creating more secret areas and sort of a richer set of ways that the mechanics interact. Let's see. I think I'm pretty much done here. I'm going to open this up for questions. And yeah, before I do, if anyone is into my work and wants to support me, most of my projects are sort of very granularly supported by very small dollar patrons. So if anyone wants to pitch in $1 or $2 a month, I'd appreciate it. And yeah, I think I'm open for questions now if anyone has any. Ooh. All right, we got first one right here.
Hey, so I was noticing in a lot of the footage or demo you showed here, there seems to be a lot of variation, like in the humanoid figures, both in this one, either if it's the lighting or just the color variation on the details, and also there's seems to be changing and morphing of the humanoid forms themselves. I was wondering what thought was behind that.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so there are a couple of like specific examples of this. Okay, so you have, I don't know if I had this in my slides actually, but okay, so you have the skeletal form here, which, and then you also have this like fleshy form of the main character. That's like one axis of variation. And then you also like editing here. Okay, so then you also have this tall version of the main character, and whenever you're in a space that you can't fit in, you shrink to this sort of like half-size version. And then you also have spaces such as the stairwell that I was in earlier, where you get a sort of an echoing effect. Portions of the screen will be duplicated with horizontal stretching or squashing. And yeah, I was drawn to the ways, so part of that is wanting to ground it in abstraction. Was drawn to the ways that like having a somewhat, I started with just the height variation, and I liked the ways that that pulled you out of like looking at it as a literal physical space. Like if my character is this physically plastic, then like, so yeah, here we go. Here's this area with this like sort of doubling effect. Some portions of the screen anyway. So yeah, I like that it's very hard to like look at this as a like solid physical object. Like it must be something else. It must be like something slightly fuzzier and more like open to interpretation if it behaves this way visually. And I also think just like because of my own lived experience, there was a certain appeal to having a character that that had both a certain lack of control over her physicality and also like a certain plasticity. So I think it's coming from both of those places, really. Next question.
What is the significance of the crosses? I see a lot of crosses in
There
this.
are, it's true. This is something that I haven't really personally tried to pin down too much. My personal approach toward visuals and visual language and like the language of ideas is to connect things somewhat intuitively rather than having like a rote one-to-one mapping of some sort of construct to an idea or a symbol. I find myself, I will say this though, I find myself somewhat drawn toward like symmetrical crosses. So like if you have like a 3x3 grid and you draw like a little set of 1x3 bars that are at right angles to each other in the center, like that shape specifically crops up a lot for me. Although here I am with like one that's a 5x5 here. And then there are also like levels of the game that have crosses in them. Let's see, there's one really, really far in here somewhere. I'm gonna have to press the right arrow like 50 times here, so bear with me. Yeah, it's a pretty large game. I saw it though. There it is. Yeah, so here's one that also has a cross that's like close to that 3x3 again. And then you also get like, the cursor's probably kind of hard to see, but these little sort of ambiguous crossbone things, which are like also sort of cross-shaped. So yeah, I don't have a pat answer for that, but there's definitely some sort of magnetism there for me. And then, oh yeah, to flesh that out a little bit, so the pluses, the crosses are pluses, and these minuses here are things that appear randomly over the course of the game that let you optionally speed up or slow down the game, which doesn't do anything mechanically. It's just a question of personal preference. And you can also, if you don't want them, you can just shoot them, and then they won't, like it won't affect your score at all, and that way you can avoid picking them up if they happen to be in your way. Next question.
This is a completely off the board question, but just looking at the visual design and the homage you have paid to classic Lode Runner style games, I noticed that character set, that font, fills me with nostalgia. It just reminds me of so many old systems. And was that something, was that character set, that fixed width font, was that based off an existing font, or is that something you just drew?
So this is, there's a sort of convergence that happens if you try and draw a font that fits within an 8x8 tile. If you're trying to do Roman capital W's and capital M's, you quickly realize it cannot be less than 5 characters wide because you won't have enough room for 3 verticals and 2 gaps. And similarly, there are other types of convergence that assert themselves with other letter forms. So there's this thing that I've seen. I'm really into lo-fi font design, and across many different systems and many different pieces of software, you end up with these same 5x7 capitals, almost pixel for pixel, reasserting themselves over and over. And you'll see little tiny weird differences between the sets. So it's like it's not people copying each other necessarily. It's also just that's how you can make a K within an 8x8 block that has spaces. And I find that a really fascinating phenomenon. This particular font is one that I made. The lower cases look a little more divergent, but the capitals, I mean, they're anti-aliased, which I guess makes them differ from a lot of these sort of classic block fonts in a way, but the letter forms are really very much in that vein. The font that this one draws from the most is the default Apple II all caps font, which is like a really austere 5x7.
Any other questions? Oh, back up here.
Crap, my mouth was full of food. Okay, so
Happens to the best of us.
yeah. I noticed, compared to a lot of your other works, there's a lot of contextualization, or like things in this game are things. Like certain rooms are like a kitchen, or
Right. Especially in the hub world, yeah.
yeah, and you even name some of these rooms and stuff. So
Right. So
guess-
these are all in-game worlds, which tend to be a little more abstract. But even so, you end up with this sort of like increased kind of physicality or like sense of groundedness in like how electrical systems work, or like what's a floor and what's a wall. Yeah, there's a sort of a decreased amount of abstraction there. Yeah.
was there some particular reason you decided with this project to go that route rather than leaving everything up to interpretation?
Yeah. So I wanted to ground it in the day-to-day experience of the character, which is really kind of the heart of it in a way, even though like maybe in terms of like number of screens or like the amount of user time dedicated, the focus might be on the sort of video gamey aspects of it. The heart of it really for me is this set of spaces here, this kind of hub world in which the player like really physically exists and like carries on all their significant social and consumer experiences. And having that tie into the more abstract game worlds in some sort of material way was pretty important to me, which I think is a reason for a lot of it. During development, I seriously considered keeping everything much more abstract, actually. I'd drawn like thousands and thousands of these little 8x8 tiles, which were like much more realistic, which is sort of where the game ended up. And I was like, what if I just didn't use them, right? Like, what if a wall is just a solid square and the ladders aren't lit, and like maybe even like make the characters less detailed than they are? So yeah, I did really think about stripping it down further. And I ended up opting for this it's sort of a fluid relationship between these slightly more abstract spaces and the more grounded physical ones for various reasons, but yeah, largely because of this connection between these cycles of the player's day-to-day life. This space here is one of the ones that was most important to me, specifically this spot right here where the character is standing next to this planter in the apartment complex. There were a lot of sort of little moments like that that seemed important to include in some way, and a lot of the aesthetic decisions were motivated by how I wanted individual encapsulated moments like that to feel.
All right, I'm gonna take more questions in just a sec, but I wanted to like butt in, and there's a thing that I like here that I like from old games too, which is like way back in Mario, the cloud sprite for the cloud background tiles and the like fluffy bush on the ground background tiles are the same background tile.
Mm-hmm.
They use like the same shape, and they just kind of recolor it. And I like the sort of like the garden in that space. I think is really interesting because it looks like a fire or something.
The
But-
first Kirby game for NES is one of my favorite examples of that. I love playing that and looking at how creatively they reuse recolored versions of these tile fragments.
Yeah, it's so cool.
Yeah.
I think there's more questions. Ricky had a question, I think, and then Randy.
Hello. On Twitter, I think you were talking about what you do with color palettes, like generative color palettes, and I've been trying to work out, is it just completely random? There are some rules, right? But I can't figure
Very
it out.
few, yeah. Okay, so if you get hit, or if you, let's see, there aren't any here, but there are also these pickups, which are optional. They'll let you change colors electively. If any of those events occur, it will remap the colors. That's not how you spell randomize. Okay, so yeah, it'll do this. And what this is doing is it's running through, I think I might even have this open actually. Let's see, or not. Okay, I don't. But it's running through the palette, which is a single sprite atlas. It's like one continuous document. And it extracts all the colors from that and assembles an indexed table out of them. This is like a highly technical answer to your question. And then what it does is it stores a pristine version of that, and when it wants to remap them, it's literally applying a completely random RGB value to every single slot except for transparent and black. And then I also have another version of that remapping process, which, let's see, where's a good example of this? This is a good example. Okay, so we have these pipes here and all this fill in the background here. And that stuff is darker, and that is not coincidental. There are two colors which are used exclusively for background elements, which are still completely random, but they're value constrained to, ooh, that's a nice one. They're value constrained to the, let's see, I think 0 through 63 range offhand, which kind of gives you a more constrained and sadly less wild set of palettes, but it also enforces readability somewhat. So yeah, so this version, which is the more constrained of the two, is black is forced, transparent is forced, and then these two colors, this sort of lighter one here and this darker one here, are still wholly random but value constrained. And yeah, I would say working with random palettes here, I was really favorably impressed with like how often you actually end up with things that are really harmonious looking or interesting looking. Some of them are things I would not necessarily have chosen, but are often like really pleasing or interesting looking. Like this one here, I would never have chosen like a bright orange and like these strange luminous blue shadows with these sort of harmonious purpley colors. But it's actually pretty interesting looking, especially with this sort of like neon green thing going on. But yeah, totally random. I think having a few constraints, having like fairly limited colors per tile are sort of guarantees that there's a degree of conversation between, like a lot of these look pretty deliberate, like that one especially, that one too. Kind of, so yeah, having a few very simple constraints forces a degree of crosstalk between the colors. And really though, like highly random colors, even without like the value forcing that's going on here, are quite interesting to look at most of the time. Like it was very, like I'm literally not filtering here, I'm just like randomizing the palette over and over again. And like, that one's kind of hard to see. That one's like maybe not that beautiful, but it's sort of interesting. But really like the batting average for truly random color is actually pretty high. I was pretty surprised to see that because I'm one of those people who spend like an afternoon deciding like whether it should be like 0xf0 or like 0fx2 or like, I'm like, oh, I wish there was more resolution. But it's only like 255 per channel. And it's so sad because I can't get the shade of gray that I want. but then like, I don't know, there's something cathartic and I think educational about like delving into like more truly random palette design.
There's like kind of a follow-up to that. Is there a step of this where you're tempted to just sort of like make this into a step where it's like a Tinder interface for random color generation? Like swipe left on the palettes you like, swipe right on the one you don't want.
Yeah,
these ones.
I actually did do that.
And like like those get dumped into there's like a pile of like the good stuff.
I did do that. So yeah, I went there. So when you're playing the game, if you get hit, like for these things to spawn. Sorry, this is running a little bit slowly with the projector.
It seems really cool as a discovery tool. I know there's like a lot of procedural sound tools, like CFX or whatever, was like a staple for a long time. Was part of it was just like you could just hit the randomize button and like stumble across a thing that you didn't know you wanted.
Yeah, I love that. So, okay, let's say I like this palette, which I just got by getting hit here. If I complete this level without getting hit, it won't randomize the palette again. And then there are also these little pickups that look like Pac-Man dots or something. And you can avoid those. Like the pluses and minuses, you can shoot them if they're in your way. And so if I complete the level without touching any of those or getting hit again, I can keep this palette for the next level. So yeah, this is like the equivalent of like the accept action in a dating app, right? If you do get hit, you lose it. So it's a sort of like aesthetic reward for playing the game according to the intended rules, which could be seen as sort of malicious in the context of like this is an economically exploitative system. Or you could just kind of say, yes, I like these colors, now I can play with them and like not overthink it.
Are there any other questions? All right, I have one over here. Hang on.
So this goes a little bit back to the sort of textual specificness of like the apartment and certain rooms being very specific. But do you include sort of context to that outside of the game in like any supplemental text or anything like that, or is it just left to be gleaned? Like it's you know, to me somewhat readable, you know, pretty directly. But if you went into this without any context, you know, you might glean something differently or not that specifically. I don't know.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, is there like a specific aspect of that you'd like me to go into more?
I guess, yeah, just whether or not you include, like, you know, a write-up of... or
Right. Yeah,
how
that's a
much
tricky one.
context you want to give to that.
Right. My general tendency for this game has been to want to flesh that out a bit more, and I think, like... And I plan on doing sort of further explorations of this world in the future. And I plan on doing some more textually explicit stuff in some of those real-world spaces or whatever they are. For me, that's less about making explicit how exactly those spaces work and more like fleshing out what the lived emotional experience of the character is in those spaces. So I think I'm not interested, for instance, in having like an unlockable lore system that explains like how the world got this way, or like are the people really people, or like what is the name of the company that like runs the entire world that the player lives in. But I am interested in having a part after a really successful day at work where you like go and spend way too much money on junk food and like buy a whole bunch of bad drinks for your friends and then like lose all of your rent money or whatever overnight accidentally. So yeah, specifics in the sense of how the player felt on like day 52 and like what was the texture of the brown box that you ordered that had your new end table in it, and not so much in the sense of like how exactly are all the pieces fitting together in a broader sense.
Any other questions? I think that might be it. Loren, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're going to have a little break while we finalize some technical stuff for our relatively hardware complex tournament that's coming up. So give us a few minutes. If you want to participate in the tournament, I would, if you're thinking, well, I haven't played this game before, literally no one has played this game before. So come on up, sign up, and it's going to be, there's a slight shift. We were talking about doing 5-person teams earlier, but because computers, it's going to be 4-person teams now. So yeah, come on down, sign up, and we'll make you into teams whether you like it or not. And we will play a game that no one's played before. Thank you.
Hey, Adam,
Yes.
can we have people play Pluinola on the projector until then?
Sure.
I'll leave this running if anyone wants to play it.
Oh, yeah. What buttons do they press up there?
It's shift and
Shift and control. If you want to make that thing make weird sounds, you can come up front and press shift and control.
and arrow keys. I oversimplified the next.
I was gonna come up and talk to you about other things, but now that all has to wait. It is still.
Break it.